A piercing screech tore through the quiet morning as the patrol car skidded sharply into the exit lane of the Blue Star gas station, blocking it like a closing trap. Just seconds earlier, Anthony Harris had been standing calmly beside his sleek black sedan, one hand on the fuel nozzle. Eyes following the traffic on Cedar Hill Boulevard, unaware he was about to become the target of a prejudice that had simmered in this town for years. In that moment, his stillness only made the tension feel heavier. A black man in an elegant suit standing in the middle of a predominantly white suburb, accustomed to sameness. For some people, that alone was enough to ignite suspicion. Sergeant Mark Dwyer stepped out of his vehicle as if he owned the place. Heavy, steps, wide, strides, a gaze sharpened by challenge. He did not look at Anthony as a person, but as a question that demanded immediate decoding. In his mind, 20 years of patrol memories snapped together into a rushed conclusion. A nice car, expensive suit, black man at this hour. It did not add up. It did not belong here. It could not be clean. Anthony felt that gaze cutting across him like a blade. But he did not react. 22 years in the force had taught him how to stand firm, even when someone else tried to twist his story to fit their assumptions. His hand tightened slightly around the nozzle knuckles, flexing before he released. Stay calm. Watch. Wait to see how far they will push. Dwyer moved closer, his breath carrying the thick scent of coffee and familiar authority. He spoke in a tone Anthony had heard too many times in his career, low, sharp, crafted to provoke guilt, even where there was none. The kind of tone reserved for those they believed held less power. Deep inside Anthony, something pinched. He had watched officers like this treat civilians unfairly, and now he stood exactly where those victims once stood. Except today, the truth had not yet revealed itself. The gas station remained busy, but the sounds felt muted. A young mother's SUV engine hummed beside him. An elderly man stacking newspapers froze mid-motion. Everyone turned toward Anthony, not because he had done anything wrong, but because Dwyer had just turned his presence into an imagined threat. A familiar, bitter feeling stirred in Anthony's chest. He had prepared for this morning for weeks, reviewing every personnel file at the Cedar Valley Police Department, planning each step so he could enter his new role with the respect of the entire team. But now, right before he was set to walk through the department doors, the very officers who would soon serve under him were looking at him as if he were an outsider worth questioning. He glanced at his watch. Nearly 10 o'clock. In about 20 minutes, he would meet his team for the first time as the new chief of police of Cedar Valley. No one here knew that. And he had no intention of revealing it before the right moment. Titles alone did not guarantee respect. Truth required the right timing, and sometimes it needed patience to reveal itself. Dwyer snorted, eyeing him up and down as if inspecting evidence. To him, Anthony was just another version of the people he had arrested, even though he had no proof of anything. The weight of that assumption pressed lightly against Anthony's chest, not in a way that caused fear, but in the way of someone who already knew that when the truth came, it would sweep away every illusion of power. In the distance, Officer Kyle Porter stood beside the patrol car, one hand on his holster, eyes narrowed, waiting for something to erupt. But Anthony remained upright, shoulders open, expression calm enough to unsettle Porter. That calmness, that unfamiliar confidence only pushed both officers to assert their control even more. A gentle breeze carried the mixed scent of gasoline and pastries from the convenience store. Cedar Valley mornings were meant to be peaceful, But today the air held a collision between prejudice and reality, between imagined authority and the real authority hidden beneath that tailored suit. If Mark Dwyer had paid a bit more attention, he might have noticed the glint of metal under Anthony's jacket, a small, heavy object the entire city had been waiting for, the badge he had been given in a private ceremony earlier that morning. But fate had its own timing, and that badge remained silent under the fabric, waiting for the right moment to change everything. Anthony drew in a slow breath. His heartbeat settled into the steady rhythm of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than this. What pained him was not fear. It was knowing exactly how these two men were digging their own grave without realizing it. They thought they were in control. They had no idea they were standing before the man they would swear loyalty to later that same day. And with just one more wrong move, that truth would explode in a way none of them could imagine. The stomp of Sergeant Mark Dwyer's boots echoed across the concrete as he stepped closer, tilting his head slightly, like a predator catching the scent of prey. The aggression in his eyes was not simple suspicion. It was the arrogant certainty that he had encountered someone who did not belong. Anthony saw it clearly, as if every thought in Dwyer's hardened face had been written in bold. Not for a single moment did the sergeant consider the possibility that he might be wrong. To him, dark skin and a luxury car were already proof enough. Officer Kyle Porter circled to the right, his hand resting on the grip of his gun, a habit he always justified with the word safety. But Anthony saw something different. It was not caution. It was anticipation. Anticipation of giving orders, asserting dominance, turning a calm man into a threat on a report sheet. Porter's eyes even brightened, as if a part of him hoped Anthony would make one small mistake, just to give him permission to act. Dwyer fired questions at Anthony as if every answer were a late excuse. His voice carried the weight of accusation, despite having nothing to accuse him of. Around them, a few bystanders began to pause and watch. A young mother holding her child, a delivery worker unloading his trunk, an elderly man standing near the soda machine. They said nothing, but their eyes revealed discomfort. Not because of Anthony, but because of the officer's escalating hostility. Anthony slowly reached for his wallet, every movement deliberate and visible. His mind flashed back to the days he trained new recruits, reminding them that one sudden motion could be interpreted in a completely different way. He had spent years at that podium teaching young officers how to pace a situation, how to distinguish real threats from imagined ones. The irony was sharp. The man violating those lessons today was one of the officers who would soon answer to him. Dwyer snatched the wallet as if afraid Anthony might draw something more dangerous. He glanced at the driver's license, then back at Anthony, suspicion carved deeply across his face. Anthony felt the moment with painful clarity. Dwyer did not see his name, did not consider the possibility that he might be a businessman, a professor, or any respected professional. All Dwyer saw was a dangerous belief etched into his gaze that a successful black man must surely be illegitimate. A breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of fresh coffee and the soft hiss of the convenience store's automatic doors. That ordinary slice of life only made the situation feel more absurd. Anthony stood on Cedar Valley soil just like any resident, yet everything around him was being distorted by the biases rooted deeply in the minds of the two officers. Porter bent slightly to look inside Anthony's car, feigning suspicion, even though he found nothing. Anthony recognized that stare instantly, the stare of someone intent on creating a problem instead of solving one. Then Porter suddenly stepped back, narrowed his eyes, inhaled sharply, as if he had discovered something important. He announced loudly enough for everyone to hear that he smelled marijuana. A baseless accusation. Another wound layered on top of humiliation. A performance crafted for the audience as if they were staging a show about authority in uniform. Anthony's heartbeat slowed with every word. Not from fear, but from disappointment. If this was how they treated him, a man who once wore the badge and dedicated nearly his entire life to the profession, what happened to ordinary citizens? What did they endure when no one was watching, when no camera rolled, when no witness stood nearby? In the brief silence that followed, Anthony caught a flicker in Porter's eyes. He recognized it instantly. It was the look of a man accustomed to shaping the narrative, then forcing others to accept it. Anthony turned and looked straight at Dwyer. His gaze held no anger, no fear, only understanding. He knew men like them. He knew how they operated, how they exaggerated, how they could turn an innocent man into a problem. But what they did not know was who stood before them today. They saw a black man at a gas station. They assumed he was an outsider. They had no idea that in less than 20 minutes the man they were trying to belittle would be the same man they would stand at attention for every morning. And that very blindness would push them toward a mistake beyond repair. A mistake that would cost them their careers, their reputation, and their future. The radio screeched from the second patrol car before it had even come to a full stop, followed by the harsh sound of a sudden brake tearing through the tension-tightened air. Two officers, Linda Graves and Ethan Collins, stepped out with the posture of people convinced they had been summoned to handle a serious situation. Neither of them knew that their arrival was pushing this incident closer to the edge. Linda placed her hand on her belt, while Ethan scanned the area searching for a threat, even though the only thing in sight was a man standing still with a wallet in his hand. The shift in the atmosphere happened immediately. The bystanders, watching from a distance, moved back, perhaps conditioned by the belief that when this many officers showed up, something bad usually followed. But Anthony remained where he was, seemingly untouched by the sudden increase in uniforms surrounding him. That calmness irritated Mark Dwyer even more. In his mind, no one in this situation should look that composed. A guilty man should be fearful, a liar should be nervous, but Anthony showed none of the reactions he expected. That very composure pushed Dwyer toward something worse. He lowered his voice just enough for the public to hear each word dripping with doubt that he himself had created. People like this always know how to hide contraband, he said, planting seeds of suspicion in the ears of the onlookers. Anthony could feel the confused gazes beginning to turn toward him. Not because they believed Dwyer, but because they had seen this exact script play out too many times before. Kyle Porter stepped forward and did exactly what Anthony had predicted. He demanded to search the car using the single excuse that he smelled something unusual. No evidence, no legal grounds, only prejudice, and the desire to assert power. Anthony looked directly at Porter, his voice calm, but sharp enough to cut. "I do not consent to a search. I have not broken any law. You know you have no right to do that." His steady, precise words made Porter freeze for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough to reveal the crack in his forced confidence. Dwyer rushed in, shattering that moment by issuing an impulsive order. He instructed Linda to search Anthony's car, and Linda, despite a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, obeyed. Her hands pulled the door open and rummaged through the interior as if she expected to find weapons, drugs, anything she could use to turn Anthony into a criminal. But there was nothing. Only a document holder, a water bottle vehicle, papers, a few receipts, and a sunglasses case. Nothing at all. Nothing to grasp. Nothing to turn into justification. Ethan Collins stood nearby, and Anthony could see the uncertainty in the young officer's eyes. Ethan understood that what was happening did not follow protocol, but he said nothing. He did not dare. He did not want to challenge Dwyer, a man with more than 2 decades of experience and a reputation Ethan was terrified of crossing. His silence was not agreement. It was fear. But silence in this moment was nearly as dangerous as a blow. Anthony saw everything, every expression, every movement, every invisible tremor. He knew they were drifting further outside the boundaries of the law with each passing minute. And he knew something else. The further they went, the harder the fall would be. A heavy silence settled over the scene, pressing down on everyone watching. Maria, the gas station attendant, appeared behind the glass, her hand covering her mouth in worry. She could not hear clearly, but she saw enough. She saw the striking imbalance between a man standing still and 4 officers desperately trying to create guilt where none existed. Then, as if the universe intended to push the tension to its peak, Kyle Porter said the line Anthony had predicted, yet still felt like a cold blade against his skin. Porter lifted his head, pretended to inhale deeply, then loudly declared that he smelled drugs on Anthony. A fabricated claim, a spark set to dry tinder. Dwyer seized it instantly. He shouted into his radio for additional backup, his tone urgent, as if he were confronting a dangerous criminal. That deliberate exaggeration froze the entire station. Those recording tightened their grip on their phones. Some people stepped back, others stepped closer. No one knew what would happen next, but they all sensed the same thing. The truth was being twisted right in front of them. Anthony closed his eyes for half a second. Just half a second. Not out of fear, but because he knew the next part of this story would be the greatest test for the men who were plunging themselves deeper into their own mistakes. They believed they were in control. They believed they were managing him. But they had no idea that the truth was moving closer with every passing moment. And when it revealed itself, it would overturn everything they thought they knew. Their free fall had only just begun. The sound of approaching sirens rose from the distance, each burst coming closer like war drums, signaling a confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Dwyer let out a thin, smug smile as he listened, the corner of his mouth lifting with triumph. He believed the system was backing him, that more officers arriving would justify every wrongful move he had already made. But Anthony, standing in the tightening circle around him, only straightened his posture as if the stronger the storm grew, the steadier he became. Porter stepped forward again, tension leaking through his every movement. Beneath the layer of forced toughness, Anthony saw something entirely different: fear. Not fear of the situation, but fear for himself. Fear that the cameras in the hands of bystanders were recording. Fear that one wrong step would turn him into the center of public outrage. And yet that fear made him even more dangerous. People often make their biggest mistakes when they are desperate to prove they are right. Anthony lifted his eyes slightly, catching his own reflection in the car window. A calm face stared back, but behind it a quiet fire burned. Not anger, but the fire of truth, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. He knew no words would help him now. None of the 3 officers were ready to listen. They were too busy reinforcing the narrative they had created for themselves. All Anthony could do was wait. Wait for the moment the mask would be ripped off. A third patrol car screeched into the lot tires, burning against the pavement. Ethan Collins flinched, though he tried to hide it. Linda Graves continued tearing through Anthony's car, even though she had found nothing. Their silence revealed how deeply fear shaped the system. They were echoing fear of superiors, fear of blame, and above all, fear of admitting they were wrong. Maria, the gas station employee, could not take it anymore. She stepped outside, her voice shaky but firm. She shouted that Anthony had done nothing, that she had watched everything from the start. But Dwyer threw her only a dismissive glance. He had long grown used to ignoring civilians when they did not say what he wanted to hear. Montgomery once taught young officers that every citizen should be treated as a source of information, but Dwyer saw them only as nuisances. Anthony looked at Maria and gave her a small nod of thanks, a tiny gesture, but to her, it meant everything. People like her had witnessed too many injustices, and rarely did anyone in Anthony's position remain calm enough to acknowledge their support. Dwyer turned back, standing so close to Anthony that his breath, thick with coffee and arrogance, brushed against him. He jabbed a finger into Anthony's chest, his voice dropping into a low growl, each word hammered out with intention. He said Anthony was not cooperating, that he had an attitude, that he was resisting. Empty accusations flung like arrows, searching for a target. But they all fell uselessly to the ground, not piercing Anthony in the slightest. Then Porter stepped back, performing the very action Anthony had sensed from the moment he saw fear flicker in the officer's eyes. Porter reached to his neck, squeezed hard, then dragged his fingernails down with a quick, deep motion. A red mark rose instantly, followed by thin droplets of blood. He inhaled sharply, staggered back 3 steps, and shouted, "He attacked me! He attacked me!" Everything froze for 1 beat. Linda jerked her head up. Ethan's eyes flew wide. The onlookers gasped. Maria dropped the papers she was holding. No one understood where this sudden twist had come from. No one except Anthony. It was the one moment that made Anthony's heart sink, not because he was being framed, but because he knew Porter had just crossed a point of no return. By clawing his own neck, he had not only broken protocol, he had shattered his own future. Dwyer seized the lie instantly. He barked into his radio as if he had captured the most dangerous criminal in Cedar Valley. In mere seconds, he built an entire narrative. The suspect resisted. The suspect assaulted an officer. The suspect showed signs of violence. Not a single word was true. But to Dwyer, truth had never been as important as winning a confrontation. Anthony watched quietly, his eyes deep and unwavering. He did not speak. He did not argue. He did not react. He understood that once falsehood reached this magnitude, only one force could crush it. A truth so undeniable, it could not be buried. And that truth was right here. The station's security camera, the phones recording everything, and most importantly, the gleaming metal hidden beneath his jacket. All they needed was one more step, and they would pull it into the light themselves. And when that light hit their eyes, the entire story they had constructed would collapse in a single, devastating instant. Chaos rippled across the gas station like a storm inflated by lies. Porter kept backing away, his hand pressed over the bright red scratches on his neck, pretending to tremble as if he had just survived an attack. Dwyer shouted into his radio voice, charged with manufactured urgency, deliberately exaggerating the situation. Linda stopped searching the car and turned toward Anthony, as if he had somehow transformed into a violent threat in the span of a few seconds. Ethan stood frozen, hands stiff, at his sides, face drained of color as he watched Porter injure himself. He knew it was wrong, knew it was a trap, but had no idea how to stop it. The air grew so thick with tension that it felt like fear itself was spreading through each breath. The crowd began murmuring. A teenager whispered to his friend that Porter had scratched his own neck. An elderly woman shakily admitted she had not seen Anthony touch anyone. But their words were drowning beneath Dwyer's shouting. In that moment, Anthony felt a shift in his own heartbeat. Not the panic they wanted to pin on him, but a sinking stillness, a quiet second where he could hear the wind slide past his ear. He knew the most important turning point of the entire morning was approaching. He had waited for it. They were backing themselves into a dead corner, and all he had to do was stand still. Dwyer lunged forward, grabbed Anthony's arm, and twisted it behind him with such force that his shoulder cracked. Linda and Ethan rushed in as if apprehending a violent criminal, while Anthony remained upright, not resisting at all. They shoved him toward the side of his car, then forced him down onto the blistering pavement. Dwyer's knee pressed into his back, heavy enough to squeeze his breath into short, sharp bursts. More phones began recording. Outrage rose in the crowd. Maria yelled that Anthony had done nothing. An older man insisted Porter had injured himself. But their voices only enraged Dwyer further. He leaned his weight even harder onto Anthony, desperate to assert control under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes. At that moment, with Dwyer's weight crushing him, Anthony found his face inches from the ground. Sharp pebbles scraped his cheek. The harsh scent of gasoline mixed with the heat radiating from the pavement burned against his skin. Yet even under that pressure, he sensed something crucial. His jacket had been tugged to the side, and the one item he needed to be seen was beginning to slip into view. The badge. The polished metal, bright and authoritative, had slid free from its fold, catching the sunlight in a blade like shimmer. Anthony did not need to look down to know exactly where it was. He felt it as clearly as if it were part of him. And he knew that with one more rough pull from them, it would be fully exposed. A soft gust of wind swept through. His jacket shifted, opening a little more. Ethan, standing to the left, glanced down. His eyes froze, then narrowed. He blinked, not believing what he had just seen. Then he looked again, this time longer. Anthony felt Ethan's heartbeat change. In that suspended moment, the chaos around them seemed to halt. Only the thudding of hearts and the ragged breathing of the men standing on the edge of the worst mistake of their careers remained. Ethan opened his mouth, about to speak, but Dwyer never gave him the chance. He yanked Anthony's arm again, and that single motion pulled the jacket high, revealing the badge in its full, brilliant glare. It lay there blazing under the midday sun like a verdict delivered from the sky. Harris, Chief of Police of Cedar Valley. Linda stumbled back, her hand trembling. Ethan stood frozen like stone face drained white. Porter, the man who had fabricated the assault, stared wide-eyed, the blood on his neck seeming to thicken as he realized whom he had framed. Dwyer was still pressing down on Anthony, but Anthony could feel the tremor running through him now. Not from exertion, from fear. A fear spreading faster than any authority they had ever used to control others. The badge rested there, caught between sunlight and the storm. The truth had finally stepped out of hiding, and it took only 1 second for the balance of power to flip completely. In the moment the badge flashed before everyone's eyes, the Blue Star gas station seemed to warp. The noise, the wind, the voices all collapsed into a thin layer of sound, so faint it was almost silence. Only the breathing of the officers standing on the edge of ruin remained, along with the pounding in their chests, as the truth crashed down like a hammer. Linda reacted first. She stepped back fully, her hand covering her mouth as if she had just witnessed a horrific accident. She remembered clearly the internal memo sent just a few days earlier. Cedar Valley welcomes its new chief of police, who will meet the department this morning at 10 o'clock. Anthony Harris, 44 years old, 22 years of experience. Just those few details were enough to send a cold shock down her spine. Ethan stood so close that he could not deny what he was seeing. His eyes widened, his face twisted in disbelief. The pieces in his mind collided chaotically. Everything he had just done, everything he had been too afraid to stop. All of it collapsed into one undeniable truth. He had just participated in one of the most severe violations of his entire career and life. Porter was different. He stood motionless, staring at the badge, as if it were burning through his skin. The scratches on his neck, the ones he inflicted on himself to frame Anthony, now looked like the mark of sheer desperation. He understood instantly this could not be undone. It could not be redirected. It could not be covered up. No excuse could survive the video, the witnesses, and the truth embodied by the badge. But the worst fall of all belonged to Mark Dwyer. He was still kneeling on Anthony's back when he noticed the engraved name. First came doubt, then disbelief, then sheer panic. When the sunlight bounced off the badge and hit his eyes, Dwyer reeled as if struck. He jerked backward, lost his balance, and his knee skidded across the ground, leaving a trail of dust. His breathing broke apart in jagged bursts, like a man on the verge of collapsing. No one spoke. No one dared breathe loudly. No one escaped the shock crashing into them from every direction. Anthony pushed himself up slowly, not rushing, not showing off. He rose with the composure of a man who never needed to shout to earn respect. His vest was torn, his face streaked with dust, yet his eyes were sharp as a blade slicing through fog. He looked at each of them. Linda frightened, Ethan frozen, Porter shattered, Dwyer destroyed. Anthony spoke in a voice low and steady, each word landing like a hammer on their wrongdoing. You have just assaulted an innocent civilian, conducted an illegal search, fabricated evidence, caused physical harm, and even worse, attempted to manufacture a false crime to justify your actions. Then he stopped, turning his gaze toward Porter, cold as steel. And you intentionally injured yourself to accuse me. A man nearby could not hold back anymore and yelled, I recorded him scratching his own neck. All of us got it on video. Maria nearly burst into tears from rage and relief. I saw everything. You are tearing down the integrity of the law right in front of this entire city. Voices swelled, growing louder and louder. Outrage spread like fire meeting wind. Dwyer collapsed first. He literally fell to his knees. Both knees hit the pavement, his hands trembling as they clawed at the air, as if trying to grasp something to keep his life from shattering. His voice came out cracked and broken. Chief Harris, we did not know we were only. But Anthony cut him off instantly, his tone like forged steel. Not knowing is not an excuse. Not knowing only reveals how dangerous your prejudice has become. Porter sank onto a nearby bench, holding his head in his hands. The officer who once acted tough now looked like a child with nothing left to hold on to. Linda released her grip on her weapon and stepped away from Anthony, as if he were a truth she could not face. Ethan staggered toward the fuel pump, gripping the metal edge as he fought to steady his breathing and stop himself from vomiting. Anthony stood among them, not angry, not shouting. He simply stood there like a mirror reflecting everything they had hidden beneath their uniforms. Then he spoke slow and clear, each word driven straight into the silence. "I am Chief of Police Anthony Harris, and what you have done today will be dealt with in full." The crowd around the gas station erupted. Shocked voices, sharp breaths, horror blended with fury into one unmistakable sound, the sound of justice waking up, and the 4 officers in front of him understood that from this moment on their lives had split into a path from which there was no return. The entire Blue Star gas station seemed to explode into a strange kind of silence, a silence not of calm, but of the hollow stillness left behind after lightning strikes the ground. When Anthony Harris revealed his true identity, the air split open, leaving behind a thick shock that smothered the entire parking lot. And in that silence, the radios clipped to the belts of the 4 officers began to crackle one by one, reminding them that the world was still moving, even as their lives had just fallen apart. Linda Graves broke down first. She burst into tears before she could stop herself, fear and regret streaming down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry to form words, only tight sobs. She knew she was wrong. She had known it the moment she opened Anthony's car door. But she had chosen silence, and now that silence hung over her like a suspended sentence waiting to drop. Ethan Collins stared at the pavement, his mind sinking like it was being dragged underwater. Every word Anthony had spoken drilled into his conscience. He had dreamed of being a good officer, one who followed the law, one who fixed the rot inside the Cedar Valley Police Department. But this morning, he had stood like a dried-out tree, watching everything unravel in front of him, without lifting a finger. His cowardice wrapped around his chest like a rope cutting off his breath. Porter. His panic was no longer the fear of being exposed. It was the fear of losing everything. He touched his neck, his fingers brushing the scratches he had made himself, then looked at his trembling hand. His face shifted from pale to ashen. His whole body curled inward, as if he wished he could vanish from existence. Fabricating an injury to frame a civilian was already a serious offense. Framing the new chief of police on camera was something with no exit at all. But the one falling fastest and hardest was still Mark Dwyer. He staggered to his feet, his face flushed red with humiliation and terror. The veins in his neck tightened like pulled wires. He tried to speak, but his voice shattered like glass. Chief Harris, this can be explained. I did not." Anthony looked at him with an expression that carried no anger, no hatred. Something far worse, the gaze of a man who once believed the system could become better now, staring at the very people who kept it broken. He spoke softly, but that softness was more terrifying than any shout. He reminded Dwyer that responsibility did not lie only in wrongful actions, but in the prejudice that made him see citizens as criminals before he saw them as human beings. The crowd began to stir again, but this time there was no restraint in their anger. A middle-aged man in a work uniform shouted that he would testify. A group of college students from the station across the street rushed over phones raised high to record every officer's face clearly. A young mother, holding her child, stepped closer, her voice shaking with fury. I saw everything. Every single one of us did. Dwyer whipped around, stunned, to see that the crowd had formed a half-circle around them. In their eyes, there was no fear of the police, only outrage and the strength of truth. Anthony did not raise his voice. He simply pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. His tone was low, steady, unshaken. "This is Chief Harris at Blue Star Gas Station. I need Internal Affairs, the city's legal department, and the Federal Civil Rights Investigation Unit on scene immediately. We have a serious violation that must be addressed on the spot." The call sliced through the moment like a blade. The four officers stood there as if they had just been sentenced. The truth crashed onto them so fast none of them could breathe. Porter collapsed onto the bench, gripping his hair, as if he could rip out the memory of the past few minutes. His eyes fixed on the cracked pavement beneath him, the place where 20 years of dreamed ambition had just turned to ashes. Ethan turned away, choking back a sob. He knew he had not laid hands on Anthony, but his silence was complicity. And he wondered whether standing by watching injustice unfold deserved judgment just as much as committing it. Linda kept crying, her tear-filled eyes searching Anthony's face as if hoping for a miracle. But Anthony did not meet that plea. Justice was not mercy in moments where truth was demanded. Dwyer stepped forward at last. He tried to stand tall to hold on to whatever scraps of authority he had left. But the sound that came out of him was thin and broken. "Chief Harris, I am sorry. I lost control. I did not know." Anthony stared directly into his eyes and spoke the sentence that would follow Dwyer for the rest of his life. Not knowing is never a reason for injustice. Everyone around them fell silent. No cheering, no applause, only the heavy weight of the moment when four uniformed officers finally understood how thin the line between power and abuse truly was. And then something happened that no one expected. Anthony drew a steady breath, straightened his posture, and spoke in a voice crisp cold as steel and layered with a sorrow far deeper than anger. "As of this moment, all of you are suspended from duty. Surrender your weapons immediately." No one moved. No one protested, because they all knew that justice had shifted direction, and it now stood right in front of them, staring through the eyes of the man they had believed just an hour earlier was not worthy of standing in this place. The phone call Anthony had just made had not even finished echoing in the air when sirens rose in the distance, and this time they were not from patrol units. They were the unmistakable sounds of the Internal Affairs convoy and the city's legal representatives. Whatever flicker of hope remained in the eyes of the four officers died instantly. They understood that every path of escape, excuse, or cover-up had slammed shut, and the truth was approaching faster than anything they could withstand. The crowd had grown into a wide circle, phones raised high like the arms of an invisible court with undeniable power. Every camera was a witness. Every angle was a blade that sliced through the false story Dwyer and Porter had tried to build. No one doubted anything now. Everyone had seen. Everyone understood. The Cedar Valley Internal Affairs vehicle pulled into the lot and stopped with a firm screech. The doors opened, and out stepped the Director of Discipline, Charlotte Miller. 50 years old, with eyes sharp enough to pierce through any lie. One glance at Anthony's torn suit-bruised face, dusty skin, and the chaos around him was enough for her to grasp the gravity of what had happened. Behind her were two city legal representatives and a senior federal civil rights supervisor. None of them greeted anyone. None of them asked polite questions. What they saw spoke louder than any report ever could. Charlotte approached first. She looked Anthony over from head to toe, the torn shoulder of his vest, the dirt on his cheek, the bruise marks still fresh on his skin. Her gaze softened for half a second, a silent apology on behalf of the system. Then she turned toward the officers, her demeanor transforming into an explosion of authority. Who ordered the use of force? Who authorized an illegal search? Who submitted the request for high-level backup? Each question struck like a hammer on hot iron. No one answered. No one dared meet her eyes. Porter shook like a man standing at the edge of a tall building waiting to fall. Linda backed away completely, hand over her mouth, too overwhelmed even to cry. Ethan bowed his head, bracing his hands on his hips as if trying not to collapse. And Dwyer, the man who once walked Cedar Valley, as if he owned it, now stood hunched over eyes, darting wildly for an escape that did not exist. But there was no escape. A federal supervisor stepped forward. His voice was deep, clear, cold. All actions from this morning have been recorded on security cameras and civilian devices. We have already reviewed the beginning. His words shredded whatever fragile peace remained. No one needed further explanation to understand what awaited them. Anthony finally spoke, not with anger and not with emotion, but with the steady tone of someone confirming the truth. Calm. Final. Unchallengeable. These 4 officers assaulted me without cause, used excessive force, conducted an unlawful search, and most severely, he turned to Porter, attempted to fabricate evidence to frame a citizen. Porter nearly collapsed. His mouth opened, but all that escaped was a strangled breath. One of the city legal representatives stepped forward to document everything. Porter's violations were listed like a sentence carved in fire: self-inflicted injury, false reporting, intentional fabrication of charges, potential evidence tampering. Every line was a blow to his career, his future, even his freedom. Charlotte turned toward the remaining 3 officers, her eyes sharp enough to cut straight through them. It is not only that you were wrong. You have shattered the trust this community placed in this department. Ethan swallowed hard. At that moment, Maria, the most crucial witness, rushed forward, her voice trembling with anger. I will testify. I saw him scratch his own neck. I saw them slam him to the ground. I saw everything. The crowd nodded in unison. An entire ring of witnesses stood behind Anthony like a wall of justice, shielding him from the injustice that never should have happened. Charlotte did not hesitate for even 1 second. She lifted her hand and delivered the order with a voice like a steel verdict. Disarm them. Remove their badges. Immediate suspension. The supervising officers stepped forward to comply. The sounds followed the thud of handguns being removed from holsters, the metallic clink as equipment was taken, the snap of badges being unpinned. Together they formed a harsh but rightful symphony of judgment. Porter began to sob. Linda trembled so hard she could barely stay upright. Ethan stared at his boots in despair. Dwyer shut his eyes tightly, as if wishing he could wake up in a different world. But reality stood firm and cold. And Anthony Harris, the man they had dismissed as a suspicious nobody, stood at the center of that reality. Anthony lifted his head, looking at the faces around him. The eyes filled with belief. The people hoping for justice, the citizens who had defended him without knowing who he was. It made his chest tighten, not with pain, but with a renewed faith in decency. He spoke softly, his voice carrying like a vow. What happened today will not be ignored. Not just for me, for every citizen of Cedar Valley. And in that moment, the 4 officers understood that their lives had crossed into a darkness from which no light could pull them back. And Cedar Valley was about to witness a reform unlike anything the city had ever seen. The wind whispering through the trees surrounding the Blue Star gas station sounded like nature itself, warning those who had crossed the line of justice. When the weapons of the 4 officers were stripped away, when their badges fell from their chests and hit the ground with a cold, metallic note, like steel dropping into a grave, Cedar Valley stepped into a morning it could never return from. A morning where the very officers in uniform witnessed power shift right before their eyes, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Federal units and internal affairs teams immediately divided the area into sections, putting up temporary barriers and sealing the perimeter like a crime scene. In many ways, that was exactly what it had become. This was no longer the site of a routine ID check. This was the place where professional standards had been bent, where prejudice had been dragged into the light, where truth had been pulled out of the shadows. And everyone in the crowd felt the weight of that moment. Anthony Harris stood at the center of the chaos, yet his eyes remained steady. Not steady because he had won, but steady, like someone who had seen this coming for years, the cracks in the system, the abuses normalized by habit, the poor decisions rooted more in bias than reason. He had encountered situations like this as a regular officer, as a lieutenant, as a lead investigator. He had read hundreds of internal reports where officers like Dwyer were protected by phrases like insufficient evidence. But this time, he was not a bystander. He was the man they had underestimated the most, and the man with the strongest voice to set things right. A team of federal technicians approached with tablets and data extraction equipment. One of them spoke, "We have already pulled the security footage, sir, and we have at least 14 citizen videos. Everything that happened is recorded from multiple angles. Not editable, not deniable." Anthony nodded. He saw Porter begin to shake violently at those words, eyes glued to the pavement, as he struggled for breath like a man trapped in a collapsing room. Linda had sunk to the ground, covering her face with both hands. She was no longer crying, only silent. The silence of someone who knew every door to her future had closed at the same time. Ethan stood farther back, leaning against the fuel pump, eyes shut tight. He had not attacked. Anthony had not threatened anyone, had not scratched his own neck, but he had stayed silent. And in law enforcement, silence, while abuse happens, is complicity. Only Dwyer still tried to remain standing, though his knees shook so hard the pavement beneath him seemed to shift. Dwyer had once barked that Anthony was dangerous. Now he was the one unable to control the fear in his eyes. Anthony stepped closer, looking directly into Dwyer's gaze. There was no anger, no hatred, but something far more unbearable for Dwyer, the truth he had spent his entire career outrunning. Sergeant Dwyer Anthony said slowly, his voice deep like a drum beat. "In my 22 years of service, I have seen many officers make mistakes, but rarely have I seen someone craft a full narrative the way you did this morning. You used lies to justify wrongdoing. You used power to hide disrespect, and you used prejudice to define another person without knowing a single thing about them." Dwyer opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Anthony continued, his voice lower, colder. "You did more than disgrace the badge. You broke the trust of the people standing here today, and that is worse than any charge you will face." A city attorney stepped forward. "Chief Harris, we will begin filing charges immediately, but before we proceed with the formal documentation, we require your official statement." Anthony nodded. "I will give it. But first, there is something I want to say to everyone here." He turned toward the crowd. Silence fell instantly. Cedar Valley does not need officers acting out of prejudice. This city needs a force that listens, respects, and protects the right people. What happened today is not just my story. It is our story. We deserve a justice system that upholds truth, not bends it." A single clap echoed, then another, and then the entire circle of witnesses erupted into powerful applause. Maria broke into tears. A young mother held her child close and whispered, "Remember this. This is what real justice looks like." The 4 officers were handcuffed right there in front of everyone, not to humiliate them, but to prove that everyone is equal under the law. Porter bowed his head, tears splashing onto the pavement. Linda struggled to her feet just long enough for the cold cuffs to lock around her wrists. Ethan did not resist, only whispered a weak question he already knew had no answer. "Do I do? I have a chance to fix this?" No one replied. The chance had been there from the beginning, and he had chosen not to take it. Dwyer finally spoke, his voice trembling like a lost child's. "Harris, please, I have a family." Anthony looked at him with a sorrowful gaze. Not pity, disappointment. The worst part was not that they were wrong. It was that they never believed they could be wrong. He spoke quietly, but with the clarity of a blade. "Your family needs someone who takes responsibility, not someone who hides behind a badge." The escort vehicles took the 4 officers away. The crowd dispersed slowly, but their eyes remained fixed on Anthony, not just with gratitude, but with hope. And in that moment, Anthony understood that this day was not the day he was attacked. It was the day Cedar Valley was given a chance to start again, and he would be the one to lead that beginning. The afternoon settled over Cedar Valley in a soft golden hue, the kind of light that made every street corner seem gentler, though nothing in that glow could erase what had happened earlier at the Blue Star gas station. The city murmured as if retelling the story in hundreds of voices. From little cafes along the boulevard to quiet suburban neighborhoods, everyone was talking about one thing: the new chief of police had been attacked by his own subordinates because of prejudice, and he was the one who pulled the truth back into the light. Anthony Harris sat in his newly assigned office within the administrative wing of the Cedar Valley Police Department. The room, once bright and orderly, was now filled with files, reports, statements, and evidence collected throughout the day. The afternoon sun poured through the window, casting a warm glow onto the badge resting on his desk. A badge so bright it seemed to still carry the metallic flash that had saved him from a false accusation that morning. He stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the training yard. Young officers were running drills, a few others helping teenagers play basketball in the community court. A peaceful scene completely opposite of what had unfolded hours earlier. Yet it was precisely that peace that troubled Anthony. Cedar Valley had the potential to be a city built on trust, but that potential had been twisted for too long by those who misused their authority. The office door opened softly. Charlotte Miller, the director of discipline, stepped inside carrying a thick stack of files. She set them down and nodded. "All 4 officers have been formally charged. Federal authorities will take over the civil rights portion of the investigation. The press is waiting for your statement in 30 minutes. Anthony exhaled slowly. He had handled the media many times before, but this was different. Today, he was not just addressing reporters. He was speaking to an entire city, a city that had witnessed humiliation and the rebirth of justice in the same moment. Charlotte looked at him with a sad, yet determined gaze. "Cedar Valley needs you more than ever." Anthony said nothing. He simply looked at the badge on his desk. The metal was cold, but its light had never burned so brightly. When he stepped into the hallway toward the press room, the entire corridor rose to their feet. Young officers, civilian staff, electricians repairing lights, and volunteers from community programs all stopped what they were doing. No one spoke, but their eyes did. They stood with him. The press room doors opened, and flashes exploded instantly, accompanied by the rustling sound of dozens of pens ready to capture every word about to shape Cedar Valley's history. Anthony walked to the podium, set his hands against the wooden edge, and spoke clearly. The incident this morning was not just misconduct from 4 officers. It was a warning for the entire system. The duty of law enforcement is not to judge people through prejudice, but to protect them through truth and fairness. We will fix the gaps. We will correct our work culture. And we will rebuild trust from the ground up. The room fell silent. Not a single keyboard clicked. Anthony continued, his eyes meeting every gaze in the room. Today I was disrespected, I was insulted, I was assaulted. But I am not the only one who has ever experienced that, and that is why I am here, to ensure that no one else has to endure what I endured. A male reporter stood and asked, "What will you do first?" Chief Harris Anthony answered without hesitation, "I will ensure that justice has no limits in terms of skin color, background, or status. Any officer who steps beyond the boundaries of the law, no matter who they are, will be held accountable. Justice is not a slogan. Justice is action." The room lit up with renewed conviction. When the press conference ended, Anthony stepped outside into deeper shades of evening gold. He walked toward the department's parking lot, breathing in the wind mixed with the soft fragrance of the community garden planted earlier that spring. Each breath affirmed one truth: Cedar Valley had awakened. That night, the video from Blue Star spread across the country. Millions shared it. Thousands commented on the courage, calm, and integrity of the man in the suit who had been forced down to the pavement, yet rose with the bearing of a leader. But it was not the praise that occupied Anthony's mind. It was a single question. How many people had been treated the way he was that morning, but without a badge, without cameras, without witnesses? That question led him to the most important decision of his tenure. He turned on his desk lamp, opened a blank file, and wrote the first line of Cedar Valley's reform plan. From this day forward, justice will not wait for luck to appear. Justice will be guaranteed by the system, not left to hope. Anthony set his pen down and looked out the window. The city rested under warm yellow lights. No chaos, no confrontation. Only the stillness of a place standing at the edge of a new beginning. And he knew that from this moment on, Cedar Valley did not just have a new chief of police. Cedar Valley had a new promise, a promise that would forever change how justice was carried out in this city. From the perspective of an expert in integrity and systemic reform, the story of Anthony Harris reveals a truth that is difficult to accept. Sometimes justice is not broken by malicious individuals, but by the distorted habits that have existed for far too long within the very system meant to protect it. Yet in the moment that seemed darkest, the power of truth of evidence and of unwavering resolve overturned a situation that appeared beyond repair. Justice does not arrive by luck. It arrives when someone stands tall, takes action, and protects what is right despite the personal cost. If you believe stories like this need to be shared to awaken the system, then like, subscribe, and continue this journey. And before you leave the video, leave a short comment. Choose justice.